Great. Thank you so much, Cameron, and thank you everyone for joining us today for the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar series. Today, we're presenting strategies to address social isolation and loneliness for people living with dementia and their caregivers. The National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar series is supported by the Administration for Community Living. Before we get started, I will turn things over to Erin Long from the Administration for Community Living for a brief welcome. Erin?
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say a quick thank you to you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for our webinar today. It's a super important topic that I know everybody's laser focused on. I want to thank Melissa Hunter from our NADRC team and RTI for her presentation today, as well as Terry O'Haran for her sharing with us what they're doing at Oakwood Creative Care. And with that, I'll send it back to you with Sari so we can get started with the show.
Thank you so much. So as you heard, today's presenters are Melissa Hunter and Terry O'Haran. Melissa Hunter is a technical assistance provider and researcher at RTI International, where she works on the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center. She has a background in social work and previously held roles at her local Department on Aging and at an adult day health program. She has experience facilitating community-wide work groups focused on social isolation, social inclusion practices and policies for older adults, and creating social engagement programming. We also have with us today Terry O'Haran, who is a certified dementia practitioner and is currently the director of the Dementia Hub with Oakwood Creative Care. Her career in human services includes over 25 years in leadership roles focused on serving the community's most vulnerable populations. She has previously worked with the state of Montana in the Addictions and Mental Disorder Division and has been the director of several memory care communities. At this time, I will turn the presentation over to Melissa Hunter to begin. Melissa?
Thanks, Sari. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. I'll be presenting some background information on social isolation and loneliness, the unique impact it has on people living with dementia and their caregivers, and some promising practices. Next slide. So that's what we really hope you'll walk away with today, a better understanding of social isolation and loneliness in the context of dementia and how to address it. Next slide. So I'll start with an overview of the problem. You've probably noticed an increase in interest and research around social isolation and loneliness over the past several years. It really feels like it started being talked about a ton during the pandemic, but just last year, the US Surgeon General released an advisory statement entitled Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation, in which he called social isolation and loneliness critical public health concerns. Next slide. So just to level set, let's talk about some definitions first and get some background. Social isolation can be measured objectively. It's essentially the size of a person's social network, the proximity of social network members, and the frequency of contact with others. Loneliness, on the other hand, is subjective. It's defined as the perceived discrepancy between a person's expectations of the quantity or quality of the relationships and their lived experience. It's also that distressing feeling of not belonging or being separated from others. So really, it's about how a person feels about the relationships with others. So a person can be kind of constantly surrounded by others and still feel loneliness. And similarly, a person who is socially isolated doesn't necessarily feel lonely. So these are distinct concepts. And on this slide and throughout the presentation, you'll see that I call them out separately in terms of impact and outcomes when applicable. So I'll start by kind of talking about the reach of social isolation and loneliness in general and among older adults. And then I'll go into kind of impact and move into the more dementia-specific side of this. So social isolation and loneliness are more widespread than many other major health issues, including smoking, diabetes, and obesity. Nearly a quarter of community-dwelling adults aged 65 years and older are socially isolated, and 43% of adults over the age of 60 report feeling lonely. So these are really big concerns with the older adult population. And this is alarming because social isolation is associated with premature death, risk of dementia, heart failure, stroke, and hospitalizations. And if that weren't enough, the cost of caring for people who are socially isolated is also higher. So according to one study, Medicare spends more than $65 billion annually because of social isolation. Next slide. So to build on the body of work related to social isolation and loneliness, the Resource Center was able to create this report looking at these issues with a dementia-specific lens. The first thing I'd like to note here is that there really is a bi-directional relationship. So social isolation and loneliness have been associated with increased dementia risk. We know people who are socially isolated are at 50% greater risk of developing dementia. And people who report as lonely are 3 times as likely as those who don't to develop dementia. And at the same time, dementia can make people become more socially isolated and lonely. So you'll see here that nearly 33% of people who are living with dementia report feeling lonely. So they can sort of build on each other in a really negative way. I'd also like to note that social isolation may cause dementia symptoms to accelerate. It can increase depression and decrease a person's quality of life. So what is it about dementia that worsens social isolation and loneliness? While we know that people's experiences are varied, there are several aspects related to living with dementia that may increase social isolation and loneliness. First, there are a range of symptoms that people may experience that could cause a person to withdraw, including difficulty remembering important events, concentrating or completing tasks, changes in movement like tremors, and behavioral or emotional changes. And these can all impact relationships. These symptoms may also interfere with a person's social connection and their ability to participate in activities that they enjoy. People who are experiencing these symptoms may delay seeking out diagnosis because of fear of stigma. And when they do start that process of getting a diagnosis, getting an accurate diagnosis can take a long time, which can leave people feeling frustrated and alone. It can also be difficult to adjust after receiving a diagnosis. So many people express feelings of powerlessness, hopelessness, and shame after a diagnosis, which can cause them to conceal the diagnosis and limit social interactions. Or if they do share, it's possible that family and friends might not know how to respond and may avoid kind of talking directly to the person about their diagnosis or starting to socially exclude them, whether they intend to do that or not. And finally, dementia can impact a person's ability to follow conversations and to communicate, which can cause both people living with dementia and their friends and family to withdraw. So as you can see, there are a lot of things that are unique to dementia that make social isolation and loneliness even more of a challenge. Next slide. The same can be said about dementia caregivers. So first, it's very much worth noting that dementia caregivers do report feeling simultaneously enriched and stressed by this role. But more than 40% of dementia caregivers report experiencing social isolation and loneliness. They also report higher stress and burden than other kinds of caregivers. So why might this be? Well, dementia is a progressive condition, and while we know that the trajectory is different for everyone, caregivers can expect the person they're caring for to decline over a period of time. As that happens, caregiver burden tends to increase because the person they're caring for often requires more supervision or they have more intense care needs. And the demands of caregiving can make it more difficult for a caregiver to reach out to family and friends. At the same time, others may believe that caregivers lack the time, energy, or interest to maintain relationships as their responsibilities increase. And this cycle can be really detrimental because caregivers with insufficient social support are more likely to feel overwhelmed and stressed, and caregiver stress has been linked to increased loneliness. Feelings of loss and grief can also occur throughout the disease process for caregivers. Ambiguous loss, which is kind of that sense of loss that occurs when a person living with dementia is still present, can be particularly complicated for caregivers, as can anticipatory grief. These can be triggered as a caregiver grieves changes to the relationship with the person that they're caring for, or kind of changes to what they expected for their life moving forward, or the person that they're caring for. So both ambiguous loss and grief can contribute to feelings of isolation because there's some social stigma around grieving before someone passes away. And there's a lack of closure there as well. So dementia is particularly challenging in these ways. Next slide. So now that you know kind of how dementia, social isolation, and loneliness all interact with each other, I'm going to turn to how to address social isolation and loneliness for people living with dementia and their caregivers. Next slide. Before we get into specific programs, these are just some items to keep in mind for all programming. So it's really critical to deliver person-centered programs. Offering a service or a program that isn't a good fit for an individual living with dementia, or providing a referral without considering how a person will access it, can exacerbate feelings of social isolation and loneliness. Choosing an appropriate program requires an understanding of the person's preferences and strengths and the characteristics of the program. Practitioners should take into consideration the purpose of the program, the way in which it's delivered, and the format, and those variables should all be matched with the person's goals and skills. And some other things to keep in mind and consider, especially for programs related to social isolation and loneliness, are geography. So kind of what is offered, where an individual lives, and how that person would get there. Technology. We know that technology can really help facilitate social engagement, but there are considerations like cost, ease of use, the need for ongoing technical support, and internet connectivity. That should all be considered before just kind of blanket offering technology solutions for people. And then language and sensory impairments, such as aphasia, hearing, and vision loss, should all be considered when designing accessible programs for social engagement. And providing program adaptations, tools, and strategies that support easier social interactions can really bolster program effectiveness. Next slide. These are some of the most common types of programs for addressing social isolation and loneliness in the research. And we'll touch on each of these a little bit more, but it's group-based support and education, arts-based interventions, friendly visitor and call programs, respite care, and care consultation. Each of these programs has shown promising results in improving social isolation and loneliness for people living with dementia and their caregivers specifically. Next slide. So I will start with group-based support and education. Group-based support and education have been shown to increase feelings of social support and decrease loneliness for people living with dementia and their caregivers. The main goal of group-based support and learning is to increase feelings of belonging or acceptance among participants. And other common objectives include improving knowledge or skills and providing opportunities for enjoyment and stimulation. Group activities can be formal interventions, or they can be less structured gatherings, but groups should be assembled based on similar experiences, interests, or disease progression. Support groups are often one of the first types of assistance offered to people living with dementia and their caregivers. The goal of a support group is to allow people a space where they can feel less alone and express themselves without judgment. They provide people with an opportunity to meet with and learn from others who have a shared experience. Structured group education or training has also been shown to improve social isolation and loneliness. Structured group education and support facilitated by professionals over the course of several weeks can help caregivers and people living with dementia find acceptance with a diagnosis and find value in disclosing a diagnosis to allow for increased social support. And structured educational offerings can build skills and understanding and build a sense of community for the participants. Memory cafes are social gatherings of people living with dementia and their caregivers, and the purpose of a memory cafe is really to provide a place where people living with dementia and caregivers can come together without fear of judgment or stigma because there's that common experience with the disease. The model is super flexible. It allows for organizations to modify the delivery of the program to fit the needs and interests of those that they're serving. And you'll hear a lot more about memory cafes from Terry, so I will leave it at that, but they're an effective way to address social isolation and loneliness. Next slide. All right, so arts-based programming. So evidence suggests that arts-based programming can have positive outcomes for people living with dementia and their caregivers. Participation in these programs can increase feelings of social inclusion, engagement, and self-esteem. They can reduce feelings of depression and improve overall well-being and quality of life. And more frequent engagement in arts programs has been associated with lower odds of loneliness. These are particularly impactful for people living with dementia because they tap into the strengths that people still have, like creativity, imagination, and emotion, that people living with dementia have even after communication and cognition becomes challenging. But one key driver of impact is that the program being delivered has an intended outcome of improving health and wellness for participants. So this is different than just like an arts and crafts activity that you might find at a senior center, because it's focused on a person's outcomes rather than the end product that a person might be creating. Arts-based programs fall into three main categories. Performing arts includes activities like participation in a choir or a theater group, and there's often an element of sharing at the conclusion, like a concert or a play. Literary arts programs involve elements of storytelling, poetry, writing, and reading. Storytelling is a really common strategy used in programs for people living with dementia, and it can help improve communication skills, build social connections, and promote self-esteem. And then visual arts is really kind of bringing people together to view art or to create art. So some of the things that we think of when we think of visual arts programs are like the memory-based programs or the museum-based programs where people come together at a museum to like view a piece of art and have a discussion on it. So those are the three main programs that we see around the arts. Next slide. All right, friendly visitor and telephone reassurance programs are really common activities that are offered by the Aging Network. Both of these programs offer older adults, including people living with dementia, with opportunities for one-on-one social interaction by providing them with a visit or a brief check-in from a volunteer. Friendly visits are typically in-person visits done with an older adult in their own home, but they can also include social outings or events. And then telephone reassurance or calls programs are brief check-ins or conversations that are done over the phone. The frequency and duration of each service depends on the needs and preferences of the person being served. These kinds of programs can increase social interactions and decrease loneliness for people living with dementia. And they also give caregivers an improved sense of security related to the person that they're caring for and improved perceived social support. One important aspect to remember for these programs is that volunteers are often the ones providing these kinds of interactions, and they are done kind of one-on-one. So training and support for volunteers that's specific to communicating with people living with dementia and the unique needs of people living with dementia is a vital piece of this. Next slide. All right, respite programs. Respite is short-term relief to caregivers, including caregivers of people living with dementia. And the goal of respite is to provide the caregiver with a set period of time to do things that they enjoy or take care of their own needs without focusing on the responsibilities of caregiving. It's also to give people living with dementia a safe, engaging social opportunity. Respite can help caregivers reconnect with the interests they had before they took on caregiving responsibilities, which can lead to reduced social isolation. Of note, respite can be provided in the home or at a facility like an adult day program. And one study found that caregivers do prefer adult day programs over other kinds of respite. Adult day programming has also been shown to improve caregiver resiliency and increase perceived social support for caregivers. And it has been associated with reduced social isolation for people living with dementia. Next slide. And the last type of program that I'm going to talk about is care consultation. So care consultation is an in-depth, person-centered process in which a person living with dementia, their caregiver, or both identifies needs, sets goals, and receives individualized resources and assistance and follow-up. It's more comprehensive than just information referral services or kind of more general education. And care consultation can be delivered in a variety of ways. It can be in person, over the phone, or via email. The important thing to remember is that care consultation is personalized based on the client's needs and priorities. Improvements in feelings of social isolation and support are the result of the participant identifying them as needs or concerns, intentionally working on a plan to better those outcomes, and receiving ongoing support and coaching to reach those goals. So if a caregiver or a person living with dementia does not identify social isolation or loneliness as a need, the impact of care consultation might not show up in those areas. If and when they do identify that need, coaching can be made available related to communicating a diagnosis with others, asking for help, and building or expanding social networks. Next slide. Okay, the first step to addressing social isolation and loneliness for people living with dementia and caregivers is identifying whether or not they're experiencing it. So tools to screen for social isolation and loneliness and to measure the impact of the programs do exist. And I've listed some of them here, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but did want to specifically highlight that the instrument resource list that the NADRC regularly updates and posts is going to be linked at the bottom of this slide. And this includes a list of measures of social wellness with links to relevant research, sample questions, and also tips for what to consider when choosing an evaluation instrument. And it's also being updated currently, so there's an even newer and shinier version on the way soon. Next slide. And then finally, if you're even looking for more detail than what I just went through, this is the report that the NADRC released last year with everything that I just discussed. The paper gives more detail related to the unique impact of dementia on social isolation and loneliness, tools for measuring these experiences, and 5 common types of programs that we just went over. But there are also additional resources in there and examples from ADPI grantees for addressing social isolation and loneliness that are linked throughout the paper, along with tips for sustaining related programs. So that might be a helpful resource as well. Next slide is 3 slides of references. So we did our work here. And then you can just click through those. Perfect. Thanks so much. That's all that I have. And then I'm going to hand it off to Terry to talk more about the work that they're doing at Oakwood Creative Care.
Hello, everyone. My name is Terry O'Haron, and I work with Oakwood Creative Care, and I'm the director of the Dementia Hub. And so I am pleased to be with you today to addressing social isolation and loneliness through memory cafes. Next slide, please. First, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our funders. This project is supported by the Administration for Community Living, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, as part of a financial assistance award totaling $999,039, with 100% funding by ACL and HHS. The contents are those of the author and do not necessarily represent the official views of, nor an endorsement by ACL, HHS, or the U.S. government. Next slide. The participants in this webinar today will gain practical knowledge on how to develop a successful memory cafe in your community and the benefits and challenges of hosting them. We'll also learn why participation in a memory cafe is a successful strategy for reducing social isolation and loneliness for both the person living with dementia and their caregiver. The next slide. So I do work for Oakwood Creative Care, and I wanted to just take a moment to talk a little bit about our organization. Oakwood Creative Care is a nonprofit organization in Mesa, Arizona, which began in 1975 and was formerly known as Serene Adult Day Health Services. In 2013, the organization was rebranded, and the current leadership brought a fun and innovative approach to adult day clubs, also known in the industry as adult day care. Oakwood Creative Care supports the dementia community by offering 3 adult day clubs. We have a COPE program. COPE stands for Care of Older People in Their Environment, and this is a clinical dementia coaching program that is evidence-based and led by our occupational therapist. And then the newest addition to the Oakwood family is the Dementia Hub. This is a community center that hosts the Memory Cafés, educational seminars, social events, memory screenings, a dementia choir, and so much more. And through the generosity of the ACL grant, Oakwood Creative Care has established the Dementia Hub. Next slide. So OCC's mission is to enhance the quality of life and spark joy in older adults with cognitive and physical challenges, as well as their caregivers through day clubs, memory cafes, and other home and community-based services. Next slide. So social isolation is an important topic as it relates to the families impacted with dementia. As we heard earlier in the presentation, more than 40% of dementia caregivers experience moderate to severe social isolation and loneliness. So when families receive a dementia diagnosis, they often feel lost. They don't know where to turn to. They don't know what their next steps are. And many are unaware of the resources and supports that are out there and available to them. So we also realize that there's a lack of inclusive community gatherings for people living with dementia and their caregivers. On the other side, we also recognize that socializing can boost self-confidence, personal autonomy, and well-being for all, and that everyone has basic needs that are critical for good health and happiness. These include those things like socialization, meaningful activities, and human connection. Next slide. So when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're reminded that every single one of us has the same basic needs. And both the person living with dementia and their caregiver needs that sense of connection and belonging just as much as you and I do. On this pyramid, there are 2 areas that are positively impacted through memory cafes, and they are love and belonging and esteem. Next slide. So we asked ourselves questions like, how do we overcome these obstacles and challenges to give people feelings of community and fellowship that we all crave and want? How do we move beyond traditional support groups? And how do we create a village of community resources and support? So we believe we're going to advocate for inclusivity to overcome fear and stigma of dementia. Next slide. So here are some of the stepping stones that Oakwood Creative Care took on the journey towards our first Memory Cafe. Oakwood Creative Care, in partnership with the Mesa Chamber of Commerce Aging and Health Committee, was the driving force for the dementia-friendly initiative in Mesa, Arizona. After conducting a community needs assessment, one initiative was to create a safe, inclusive space where the person living with dementia and caregivers could find hope, community, connection through the creation of memory cafes. These social gatherings are both stigma-free and no cost to the participants. OCC is currently the lead organization for the Dementia-Friendly Task Force of Mesa, who helps organize and host the memory cafes. Next slide, please. So our beginning. So as we heard, a memory cafe is a social gathering where both the person with dementia and the caregiver may be a friend, a family member, someone coming alongside them. So they can get together with other families on the same journey. They can enjoy connection and belonging and friendship and support from one another. Memory cafes are unique and can look different from one cafe to another. So please note that as I refer to the cafe, this is the way that the Dementia Friendly Task Force of Mesa has designed our cafes and are working very well. So in our beginnings, our first cafe was held in July of 2022. And the Dementia Friendly Task Force of Mesa consisted of about 6 people at the time. We started by renting a room at a multi-generational community center. We had less than 10 people in attendance for the first few months, and the cafe was being offered 2 times a month. Next slide, please. Now we want to introduce the Dementia Hub and our current day cafe. Next slide. So as you can see from the pictures, we have experienced enormous growth. We have expanded and increased the number of our monthly cafes to match the needs of our community. We went from having 2 cafes per month to then offering it weekly as we moved into the Dementia Hub and started hosting our cafes here. Then more and more families kept coming, and we were at the point of being full space. There was no space in our cafes on some of our days. So with that tremendous growth, our team looked at the needs and decided as a task force that we would be able to change our offerings to match the community needs. And then we changed it over to now offering 2 memory cafes per week. So participants have an option. They can join us for a Tuesday afternoon cafe or a Wednesday morning cafe, which gives them more options and flexibility in their schedule. We are now hosting 60 to 80 people per week with our cafes. And as our needs are growing, as the needs of the community are growing, we are also able to look at specialty groups that are starting to form. So for example, we have on some days, once a month, during our cafe, we are able to offer a men's group as well. And we're also looking to launch a support group inside the Memory Cafe for people living with dementia who live alone. So we're starting to find families who are identifying that they have specific needs, and we're trying to meet that need within the Memory Cafe. Next slide, please. So the makings of the Mesa Memory Cafe. As I mentioned, Oakwood is the lead organization, and we host our cafes here at the Dementia Hub. And OCC covers the cost of the Memory Cafe's basic supplies. So we have our Dementia Friendly Task Force, and our task force is a robust task force, and it's the backbone of our cafes. We now have 17 task force members, which include both professionals and family caregivers. All members of our task force go through a vetting process. And before they're done, they are asked to sign a 1-year commitment that helps us to know that they will be there for us to offer these cafes. It gives us great stability and consistency as we are planning for the future. And it also allows us to assign our task force members roles and tasks so that our memory cafes run very smoothly. The task force, because a lot of them are professionals in the community, are a wealth of community resources for our families that attend. The Memory Cafe, we have participants that are greeted at the door like family. So as they come, they have big smiles that are waiting for them, hugs. They feel safe and welcomed. If they are regular participants to our cafe, we move from giving them a temporary name badge to a permanent name badge. Some of the other things we do is that we set up our cafe for the first 30 minutes. Everyone is welcomed in, and the person living with dementia and their caregiver enjoy coffee and tea, snacks, while they socialize with each other in a comfortable community room. Our cafe provides that wonderful space for the families to get to know each other and to really have that old-fashioned coffee and chat time. And so that is the first 30 minutes of our Memory Cafe. After that, we break up into 2 groups. So for our cafe programming, we have a support group for the caregivers, and we have engagement for the person living with dementia. And engagement can look like a music activity, an art activity, exercise, lifelong learning. Sometimes we have volunteers from the community to come in to provide that entertainment, but it's always something different. And then in our support group, we come together for that safe space for our caregivers to be vulnerable and to share with one another. Next slide. So for us, creating a successful Memory Cafe, we identified a lead organization. We established a dedicated task force, and this might be a group of volunteers for you. But we believe that you need a good group to start with of maybe 5 to 7 people that are dedicated and have the same mission and vision on what they want to create. Our dementia-friendly task force of MESA, as I mentioned, signs a volunteer application for that 1-year commitment, which really does help us run things a lot more smoothly, and we have consistency. We also had to identify our space. So if you're going to create a Memory Cafe, you'll have to look at your options for where you can host your Memory Cafe. Hopefully you can find a space that is free. Some good suggestions would be a library, community center, church halls, etc. And then we believe it's very important to continuously identify and recruit volunteers. The strength of the cafe for us is our task force and our volunteers, because they are the backbone. So we're always looking for engagement volunteers. And if you have a support group, as we do, we also need facilitators for that support group. And it's very important for us to create that warm and welcoming environment for everyone who enters. We place a greeter at the door, which is, we feel like, is a nice touch. It's that first point of contact, and they really can start to set the stage for that environment. Next slide. So we also seek donations. We can ask for donations for supplies, coffee, water, treats, anything that can help us with the cost of offering this cafe. We have an established resource list that we have put together for the caregiver, so that when they are in need of resources, we have an easy list that they can take with them. Our Memory Cafes are offered at no cost to participants. We also have marketing that we looked at, and so our suggestion is to start simple. You can look at your local free newspapers to put an ad in. You can create a flyer that can be passed out into community. You can post things on social media to let people know that you're hosting a cafe. And then you can place your Memory Cafe on a list of a memory care directory. And so you have on the slide an option, and there'll be more options for you to look at the end of our presentation. And then we have an engagement philosophy of how we want our engagements to run. And we think that's an important conversation. We help our volunteers to prepare for engagement by giving them ideas and possibly even curriculum to use during their engagement time, so that they can feel most prepared for that engagement. And then we also have a support group structure. And so for our support groups, we have a welcome, and we have a close, and we have a script that goes along with that. So it helps the flow of the support group to be organized and timely and structured, so that the families participating know what to depend on And that gives us a chance to welcome them into that safe space. The other thing is we recommend visiting other memory cafes, because as you travel and see other cafes as they are hosted, you get to learn their best practices and then bring them back to your own cafe. And as I would say, plan for growth. As we have said, we open the doors and it hasn't stopped growing since we opened the doors to the community. Next slide. So I wanted to share with you the Mesa Memory Cafe flyer that we created. This one is created now for 2024. And as you can see, it hosts our information, our address, the two options they have for the cafes on Tuesday and Wednesday. The cost is free, but it's a nice flyer that we're able to get out into community. Businesses are happy to take it as giving resources to families as that they come and encounter that may need the cafe. And also we have an opportunity to get it out into the hands of our medical industry, assisted living communities, and senior centers. So there's lots of places our cafe flyer can be a part of letting people know that there are resources for them. Next slide. So as we're discussing, there's many benefits of attending a cafe for both the person with dementia and the caregiver. So both of them can benefit from connecting with others on the same journey. Being in a safe space with no stigma, feeling understood, building friendships and community. They have access to weekly support. There's no financial burden. Supporting the person living with dementia to stay at home and age in place is a wonderful benefit. It combats against boredom, isolation, and loneliness. It's easy access to resources and support to ensure the needs are met. We can focus on brain health for all. And caregivers have access to education and support that can be beneficial to building hope, reducing stress, and finding comfort. Next slide. So this is a testimony from one of our participants at the Memory Cafe. He writes, "The Memory Cafe is unlike any other place I have been. It's magical and a true blessing. They make us feel like we matter and we're unique individuals. There's a sense of connection. No one is the same, and you see us beyond our dementia. Each person has a unique story to tell, and despite the challenges we face, camaraderie and joy fills the room. Connection is key. All men and women need connection, and you give us a space to be happy again. You smile, and then I smile. It's a wave of emotion that connects us as humans. I feel accepted, loved, filled with joy, connected to others, and truly blessed. I love it here." Next slide. And this is a testimonial from a caregiver who has attended our Memory Cafes. She writes, "The Memory Cafe is the first time I have felt supported since my mother got her dementia diagnosis. It is a safe space where I can be vulnerable about my feelings. The resources and the support are what keep me going and afloat from week to week. The Memory Cafe is great for both me and my mom. And when I walk in, it feels like I am amongst family. We have both made friends here. I get a lot from the support group, and I learn new things all the time that I can implement at home." Next slide. So on the screen, we have an example of our outcome measurements for our caregiver pulse survey. So we do collect a pre and post survey at every Memory Cafe that we offer. This chart that you're looking at shows that we are positively impacting caregivers in the areas of connection, support, and engagement. Next slide. So with the hosting of our wonderful Memory Cafes, there are going to be some challenges. And some of the challenges that we wanted to bring to mind are sometimes there's not enough hands to help, not enough task force members or volunteers. So increasing that number really helps with that challenge, having enough bodies to help you lift off these cafes. Another challenge would be ensuring that all volunteers and task force members align with the vision and creating an intentional atmosphere that's welcoming, inclusive, empathetic, and supportive. We want to be all on the same page and really share that same vision. Inconsistent marketing efforts can be a challenge for some of the memory cafes as they're getting their momentum going. Slow momentum can be if you're only holding a memory cafe once a month or even twice a month. That could be limiting for a family, and if they miss that one opportunity to join you for a cafe, that could be a challenge in getting enough people to attend. Also, a lack of referrals from our medical providers. One day we hope to see that the medical providers are telling all of their families that they have the option of coming to a memory cafe to receive support and gain more resources along their journey. Also, another challenge might be inconsistent donations to cover basic supplies. So in our situation, we are the lead organization, and so we do cover the basic supplies, but we do have costs for a memory cafe. So it is important that your group looks at what donations will be needed, what type of funding may be needed, and really make sure that you have a way to keep that going. And then finding a free space to host the cafe may be a challenge. Hopefully there are local resources that you can tap into. And then as we host our cafes, we want to make sure that we are reaching most of the population in our cities, and we are looking at getting diversified demographics coming into our cafes. So this could be a challenge. Also, as we've hosted our cafes, we start to recognize that there are unique needs. And so some of the unique needs that we have seen are people living with dementia who are living alone. This is unique, and they don't have a full-time caregiver with them, and they're needing different types of resources possibly, and also support. So we're looking at how we can come alongside them as well. And then also when we have caregivers who have been with us at our cafes for a length of time, we've become their community, their support system. And if their loved one has now passed, they are in a different chapter. And so that becomes a unique need because we are their support system. We want to be there for them. They are on a different chapter of their life now. And some of them have identified that they don't know if they exactly fit anymore, but we still want to be their community and support them. So we're looking at ways to support our family caregivers at that point. Next slide. So we do collect first-time guest demographics. So as the first-time guest form, we have it that it is anonymous and we collect it on their first visit. And then the data is gathered from this information. And what we can see from some of the data that's on the slide is that it gives us some insight on current participants that are coming to our cafe. And it also helps us identify areas of opportunity. For example, we see that 80% of participants identified their ethnicity as white, and 12% participants identified their ethnicity as Hispanic or Latino. We can look at this and see that we have an area of opportunity to increase ethnic diversity. Next slide. Next steps in sustainability for us. We will continue to grow our task force members and volunteers. We will also offer Memory Cafés sponsorships so that helps with the funding and the support of the Memory Cafés ongoing. We can host fundraisers. We can host different events that help us fund the cafes. We can apply for grants, and we would continue to seek anonymous feedback from the surveys and questions to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the families. And we would love to openly share our information for what we have done with other organizations that are interested in starting a cafe. And we will continue to explore ideas to support inclusivity and ethnic diversity. Next slide. So these are just some more representations of Oakwood and our families. And as it says here, everyone is welcome. Next slide. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate the time to speak on this, and I am going to turn it back to Sari.
Thank you so much, Terry and Melissa, for your great presentations, and thank you everyone for your engagement and questions. We can go to the next slide where you'll see some resources. Oh, there's some resources for you. These will be in the slides that we send out to everyone. Someone just asked about finding memory cafes in other states. That's where you can look at the Memory Cafe directory. And there's also some resources at the Percolator. So we will get this out to everyone. If you go to the next slide, please. Feel free to enter any additional questions. I just want to point out to everyone that you can go to grants.gov. The new Alzheimer's Disease Programs Initiative funding announcement was posted on April 12th, and applications are due June 11th. There is a direct link that will be in the slides. If you want to see that funding opportunity announcement immediately, just go to grants.gov and search on the word Alzheimer's. It should pop up with no problem. And if you have any questions for our webinar team, please email nadrc-webinars@rti.org. I'm going to go straight to the questions because there are quite a few. Terry, I'm going to start with you. Can you talk, there's two questions about the task force. One is asking about the vetting process, and the other is asking about the professions of the task force members, if you look for certain types of professions when you're looking for volunteers.
Thank you. So our task force is a group, as I said, of volunteers that come in from the community. A lot of them are in the senior care industry. So we have on our task force representation of hospice companies, placement agents, assisted living communities, memory care communities, medical representation, healthcare, and we are open to having a variety of people on our task force. These are the individuals that have connected with us, and we have a lot of interest from our community. So we have professionals who come to the memory cafes to just visit and spend time with us at the cafes and just are in the environment. And often they're so inspired by what we're doing, they want to be a part of this. So we don't specifically, exclude anyone to be on the task force. We would like the variety, right? We would love to have people from all different industries.
Right.
Our vetting process is such that they are asked to do at least 2 memory cafes with us. That allows us to see if they're really interested in what we're doing, and for them to see what the commitment might be. That gives them a chance to also to meet other task force members. Then there is time that they're spent with our staff to go over the application, what it would look like, what their responsibility would be, how much time is invested in this. And then from there, they make the decision if they want to join the task force.
Great,
Thank
thank you. Melissa, we had a question come in that we're asking about the art-based programming, and if there's programs specifically for caregivers and people living with dementia together, or if they're separate, and if there's, a variety there that you know of.
Yeah, it's sort of depends. I'll say there are, programs that are specific for people living with dementia, and then there's programs that are for the dyad. Like those museum-based programs, for example, are often for dyads to kind of come in together and, view art together and have a discussion. But yeah, it does sort of depend. There's a little bit for everyone.
Great, thank you. Terry, we had a few questions come in about the Memory Cafe and at what stage of dementia do people living with dementia join the Memory Cafe? Can it be any stage or is it only early stage? Can you give a little bit more information on that?
Absolutely. So everyone is welcome, and that is a true statement. So anywhere along their journey, we would love them to be a part of our Memory Cafe. We have recognized that people who are on the early side of this journey may have a hard time fitting into the second portion of the cafe. So the community piece of the social is so important for everyone. And if they are early on their journey and feel like they don't fit in the activity piece, because we have had people identify that, then they are welcome to still be a part of our cafe in any way they feel most comfortable. But we do not deny anyone on any part of their journey. They are all welcome to be here at the cafe.
That's great. Thank you so much, Terry. So there are quite a few more questions. One that I thought was interesting that I wanted to get your take on in the last few minutes, we probably can hit a few more of these. Can you share a little bit more about the engagement philosophy that you talked about?
Yes. So Oakwood Creative Care does an excellent job of believing that the person with dementia has their abilities still, and we focus on their strengths and abilities. So we, as a motto, don't believe in things like bingo. We really want someone to be very engaged. So we know that the creative part of the brain is still functioning and firing, and we want to tap into that part of a person's brain. And so our engagement philosophy really is to look at engagement opportunities that are hosted in our memory cafes so that people can really be a part of the activity, and setting it up for people to be successful. And so focusing on those strengths of our individuals that are participating, and then also making sure that our instructors or our facilitators of the engagement feel confident so that they can walk in and have a fun, vibrant, engaging class where our participants are laughing and feeling just that sense of joy.
Great. Thank you so much. Terry, another question came in with asking if you can talk a little bit more about the men's group you mentioned. Is that
Yes.
just male caregivers? Is it male caregivers and people living with dementia or something else?
So for the men's group that we have started, we are now offering it once a month, and it's inside of our Memory Cafe. So because of the growth that we were having, sometimes our support groups are actually too large. And in the space, we had identified that a lot of men are now starting to attend our cafes. We've seen the growth over the time. So we have gone through and identified that they have specific needs of asking questions. They don't feel the same skill set sometimes on being the primary caregiver for their loved one. And so we have broken off a second support group during our cafe, and the men come to a separate room, and then we come together, and they are the caregivers. And so the caregivers, who are men, are together, and we have found a male facilitator who is a nurse who is coming in to facilitate those support groups, along with myself sometimes. And we're able to kind of give them and hold space for them in a different way. They truly appreciate having an opportunity to come together as men and to share their concerns in a safe place. And sometimes they'll ask questions and be able to talk about things that they may not share in our regular support group with men and women together. So it has been very fruitful. And at this point, we're committing to at least once a month doing that.
Great. Thank you so much. So I think that's all the time we have for questions. We did not get to all of them. If you would like us to try and respond to your question directly, I just put, again, in the chat feature, the email address where you can reach our webinar series, and we can forward your questions to presenters if you would like. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for your engagement in the session, and thank you, Terry and Melissa, for your presentations. We would love it if you would join us again on May 22nd for our next webinar, Unique Approaches to Support Brain Health and Reduce Risk Through Education, Exercise, Diet, and Art. You should have received registration information through our email if you're on our listserv, and we will send a reminder as well. Please contact us at the email address I put in the chat if you have any questions or if you didn't get that announcement and you would like to have it. So thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.